Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Candace DeMatteis, Policy Director for the Partnership to Fight Chronic Disease. Thank you for joining us today for the third segment of At What Cost, a series of discussions with leading experts to talk about new research and their perspectives related to what we know now and what we can anticipate as the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, particularly related to drug coverage, Medicare drug coverage, continues to unfold. The series examines concerns raised by patient groups and will review the early evidence related to the IRA's impact on the issues that matter most to beneficiaries and patients alike. The IRA includes a lot of changes to Medicare prescription drugs program. While much of the attention has focused on drug pricing, the IRA also fundamentally changes how drugs are covered and who pays for what. Those changes will have a significant impact on the affordability of coverage, availability of choices among Part D and Medicare Advantage plans, and ultimately access to medicines. The announcement of Medicare pricing for the first 10 drugs subject to the new program is tomorrow. At least that's what we've heard. And announcements about Medicare Part D base premiums came out earlier this month. Millions of Americans with chronic conditions, including diabetes, cancers, high blood pressure, mental illnesses, and autoimmune conditions, depend on affordable access to prescription drugs. The drugs selected for Medicare pricing aren't necessarily the most expensive, but their high usage among Medicare beneficiaries adds up for Medicare. As a result, lowering spending means beneficiaries will face higher utilization management. So things like step therapy, prior authorization, and differences in where medicines are placed on formularies. And those actions can limit access. Our first webinar examined the alarming trends in the loss of zero premium Part D plans for beneficiaries receiving low-income subsidies, a trend that started before the IRA, but there are concerns that the IRA is accelerating those losses. We also discussed the IRA's impact on health equity. Our second webinar covered the many changes to Part D coverage included in the Part D redesign elements of the IRA and what they mean for beneficiary costs, plan and taxpayer costs, and access to medicines. Both of these webinars are available on PFCD's YouTube channel, and we invite you to take a look at them if you missed them. Today, we're focused on unmet medical needs, the challenges people living with serious chronic illnesses face, and what the IRA's impact on innovation could mean. Experts agree that the IRA will lead to fewer new medicines in the future, but they disagree on the extent of those losses. It's also really important to remember that many of those estimates don't include losses from the R&D that leads to new indications for a drug after it already obtains its first FDA approval, which is really important. If you just look at the initial list of 10 medicines for drug pricing, most of them have FDA approvals for more than one medical condition, and most of them have multiple FDA-approved uses. To understand what the losses to innovation may look like, the research firm Lumanity examined existing FDA approvals for medicines that treat lung cancer, rare cancers, rare autoimmune conditions, severe depression, type 2 diabetes, and stroke prevention. By looking at the R&D history of these medicines and their impact on patient health, Lumanity was able to show what could have been lost had the IRA been in place when those innovations occurred, and give us some evidence of what we may be looking at in the future. Today, we're joined by several experts to explore some key questions, including what are some of the challenges that people face when they are living with a serious chronic illness? And why is continued innovation so important, particularly for people living with cancer, autoimmune conditions, and serious mental illnesses? How might reductions in innovation impact people's health, particularly people living with these diseases? With that, let me dive right in and introduce our guests. Presenting data and findings today is Martin Strebel-Ventillo. Martin is a principal at Lumanity, a multidisciplinary strategy firm that aims to accelerate and optimize access to medical advances for patients. He has extensive expertise in primary market research and strategy development to support new product commercialization across a range of therapeutic areas, with a focus primarily on oncology and transplant care. Following Martin's presentation, we'll hear from experts who advocate on behalf of people living with autoimmune diseases, schizophrenia and psychosis, and cancers. Back to Lumanity for a minute, though. In their work, Lumanity identified several key advances in treatment for different diseases and asked, what if the IRA had been in place when these medicines were being developed? What might be different? And what would be the patient impacts? Martin, we look more forward to learning more about what you found. I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Candace. So we're going to look at a few case studies today. The slides should be showing up shortly. Great. Thank you so much. And we're starting off with what I think is one of the key areas of concern, at least for myself and my colleagues, when it comes to the IRA and its impact on innovation, which is cancer. And a case example that I'm showing here is lung cancer that really still needs a lot of innovation despite the great advances that have been made recently. And what we're highlighting here really has to do with the treatment paradigm in cancer, where you first have to start testing out these often very toxic therapies in patients that have no other options and have experience with several other treatments already before you can advance them to earlier stages of treatment, such as the first lines of the first treatment that a patient would receive when they're diagnosed. And ultimately, what would be the best solution, obviously, is to cure cancer, which currently we can almost only do in the setting where we can resect the cancer and then support that resection with what we call adjuvant treatment. So the challenge is it takes years for a cancer drug to advance through this treatment paradigm of testing it out in patients that have had several other treatments and have failed those, all the way to where we can resect a cancer, cut it out, and treat it with adjuvant therapy. So this is often post-approval research, and it comes later in the life cycle. And so what the IRA does is really it cuts down the incentive for companies to explore these additional options. And yeah, thank you. Patients don't fail treatments, treatments fail patients. That is absolutely right. Pardon my lingo here. That is colored by the industry side. But what it comes down to is patients may be deprived of options that may serve them better at earlier stages in their journey. So after years of research, for example, we have a case here where a real life drug was developed for non-small cell lung cancer, originally indicated for patients that had prior experience with treatments. 3 years after that original approval, being approved for patients as a first line, and then 5 years later as an adjuvant treatment, so to help patients that had had a resection and treatment to support that resection to make it more effective in the long run. So this, and then 9 years, so definitely way past the point where the IRA would have had an impact on this drug. There are new combinations still being evaluated by that company and bringing really great benefits to patients as a combination treatment. Now, we worry starting about 3 years in about whether the innovation would still be incentivized, and cancer with that huge unmet need, we do need to keep incentivizing going earlier in the life cycle, in the treatment journey for those patients. Now, if we imagine that this 5-year in approval in adjuvant non-small cell lung cancer had not happened, we would have lost out on a great benefit that this drug currently confers to patients. Now, it's not solving the problem and it's not always curing the disease, but instead of the 28 months of disease-free survival as a median with this drug, patients were able to, on average, survive 66 months without the disease recurring or without death. And over 10 years or so, if we think about what does that mean, we would have lost if the IRA had disincentivized development of this indication, about 60% of the life years that we currently see saved by adjuvant treatment. So it's quite a meaningful impact on lung cancer patients if we worry about the IRA sort of disincentivizing earlier stage treatments in the way that we're currently looking at the way that the policy is written. So it's a real danger, especially in oncology, and there needs to be some sort of discussion around how we can, with the treatment paradigm being what it is for many clinical and ethical reasons, how we can overcome that and continue to see innovation the way we are currently in cancer indications that still are very challenging to treat. So with the IRA, we worry, just in summary, that we are shortening the lifespan and limiting the treatment options for patients with lung cancers in particular, and cancers more generally. On the next slide, I think we have a little bit of a different flavor of cancer-related challenge. Sorry, we're going to skip ahead to mental health medicines for a second before we get back to cancer. Here, there's another aspect of the IRA that's particularly challenging. If we think about mental health, a lot of these therapies need to reach the brain for obvious reasons. And so from a scientific perspective, small molecules are really the way to go because these therapies can cross the blood-brain barrier, which biologics cannot most of the time. And so in addition to that, it is really challenging to develop new drugs that address mental health issues because we really have a poor understanding of the field. And so there's an intrinsically high risk. And now if you layer on the fact that the IRA disincentivizes small molecules by having the price controls implemented much faster than for biologics, we're really hitting an area where there's extreme unmet need, particularly hard by specifically disincentivizing the treatment modalities that are most suited for patients with mental health issues. Another complicating factor is that there are a lot of generics in this field that do not always work very well. But what they do mean for the discussion is that the prices are really low. And so you're looking at what is likely to be a very strong reduction in the pricing for any new innovative therapies after those pricing controls come into play, and because they're often small molecules after a pretty short amount of time. So it is really challenging, specifically in the mental health field, to think about what the IRA might do to the development and innovation in this field. So an area that we looked at here were the next generation antidepressants that came out quite a while ago and luckily did improve quite significantly the side effect profiles of therapies that are available for patients suffering from depression. So quite significant reduction in sexual dysfunction, blood pressure disorders, and weight gain. What that meant is that the second generation antidepressants had a much lower discontinuation rate. And so a lot fewer patients had to stop their treatment because of those side effects. If we think that the IRA really disincentivizes development in the mental health space for the reasons I outlined before, there's a real threat to these kinds of therapies or these kinds of improvements reaching the patients. And so what that would mean concretely, had we not developed these next generation antidepressants, 1 in 5 people treated for depression would have stopped taking their medicines because of side effects. If we hadn't received the option of the second generation or next generation antidepressants. So really quite a significant impact on the treatment options available to those individuals that really need more options and better treatments, even today with these second generation antidepressants available. And so the big threat in the mental health space is, like I said, the IRA currently is designed in a way that unfortunately disincentivizes the development of molecules that are primed to be the modality of choice in this space. Additionally, a lot of these treatments often are subject to post-approval research, so they get investigated for additional mental health indications after the first approval. And that is, of course, because of the timeline of the IRA and that specifically short timeline for small molecules, a particular threat that within the mental health space, we may see a reduction of innovation because of all these reasons outlined above. So really showing great concern here about the impact on patients suffering from mental health conditions if the IRA does, in fact, disincentivize the development in a way that we anticipate. And hopefully steps can be taken to ameliorate the situation in this space in particular. The next case study I'd like to quickly talk about is rare autoimmune diseases. Autoimmune diseases, again, an area where we still are working on better understanding how these diseases work. And luckily for us, I guess, there's a couple of drugs that have sort of broad stroke mechanisms of action that are actually applicable to a number of autoimmune diseases. And so what is often observed in the autoimmune space in particular is that one drug can be developed for multiple conditions. It sort of brings benefits to patients across a spectrum of disorders. However, often these are spread out over a longer period of time. And so in the case example that you see here, there was a drug that was first launched in a rare autoimmune indication in 2007 and then didn't have the last approval for a rare progressive inflammatory disease that leads to vision loss by 2019. So you can clearly see how the negotiation eligibility, even for a biologic time frame, which we are a little less concerned about, at least initially, than for small molecules, would really impact the viability from a commercial perspective for these add-on indications. Now, that means that the company really has to think about whether it is worth or even feasible for them to continue development with these agents that have multiple indications. And if we think that the IRA does disincentivize particularly indications added on at a later stage in the life cycle of a drug, we could worry here very concretely that two of these indications, so the rare inflammatory vision loss that I outlined, as well as progressive muscle weakness that is also part of the number of conditions this medicine can treat, we can really anticipate that these two conditions may not have been developed. And so the post-approval studies here that led to these approvals would really be jeopardized by the IRA. And that concretely would have meant, even in this space where only very few patients suffer from these individual conditions, but imagine this example sort of being extrapolated to the huge variety of rare conditions that have no treatments. Within that rare progressive muscle weakness, that treatment was the first FDA-approved option for patients in more than 60 years. And you are looking at about 900 patients per year that may not achieve remission from that condition if that option wasn't coming on the market. And that also amounts to about 530 hospital visits per year, just given that the improvements that this drug offers may not have been realized. And this is just for a relatively small population of about 50,000 patients in the US. So think about this case study as a small sliver of a broader phenomenon and sort of imagine what that means for so many of the rare patient communities that need so much more innovation. On the other side, there's only 6,000 patients suffering from the rare progressive inflammatory vision loss example here that is also really at risk in a post-IRA world if we look at this development of that drug. And what that would mean is that even though it's only, quote unquote, 6,000 patients, 180 patients a year would have become permanently blind or visually impaired. About 350 patients a year would experience a relapse of their condition, and that makes them 13 times more likely to relapse without this new option if you compare that to the standard of care that was on the market before. So really a threat of the IRA to impact patients suffering from these rare autoimmune conditions. that innovation for them is jeopardized, particularly, again, because of that treatment paradigm within the autoimmune space, that one drug often serves multiple rare diseases at once. The other challenge as well is that the IRA, of course, disincentivizes treatment being developed for multiple rare conditions. So if you're aware, only if the treatment is indicated for a single rare indication, if it's more than that, you're still subject to price negotiation. Whereas if you only develop a single rare disease, you are not. And so you can see how that might disincentivize in general the development of any additional rare indications, which is not the direction we want to go within this space. This, again, has so many patients, even though their individual conditions are rare, but we have many, many, many patients that overall suffer from rare conditions. And so we really need to incentivize having treatments for more and more of those, and not incentivize limiting the number of indications for a single treatment to be a single one. And that's a key limitation of the IRA in its current form that really may worsen outcomes for a significant number of patients. So here in this one example, we have about 1,500 people with debilitating rare diseases that would suffer every year just because of this single drug being impacted. And so imagine that being sort of extrapolated to the whole universe of rare disorders and the treatments for those. The next example is sort of an overlap of what we talked about already with rare cancers and cancer at large. So I think what we already highlighted is that because of the cancer treatment paradigm, it's really challenging to sort of imagine how the IRA would not disincentivize cancer treatment development, especially for the highest unmet need patients that are not that have not been failed by treatments yet. But the other aspect is that many cancers do fall in the rare disease space. And if we think about cancer drugs, similar to the other examples, they're often developed for multiple indications. So if it works for one cancer, it has a good chance to work for a number of other cancers as well. And given that we're looking at many rare conditions within the cancer space, that means that by that fact I outlined of one mechanism addressing multiple diseases, you have many cancer drugs that are approved for multiple rare indications. And if we think back to the fact that I mentioned that you are now under the IRA disincentivized to add additional indications to your first lead, because that would mean you make yourself eligible for price negotiation. So what that means is you're disincentivizing any additional research beyond the first indication that would make that drug available to more patients. If we're looking at what that means in terms of numbers, in 2022, there were so many cancer drugs that apply to multiple cancers that you have about 80,000 patients that are on drugs that were approved for multiple rare cancers. Of those, only about 50,000 were within what we would characterize as the largest indication, and the indication that is not as strongly disincentivized by the IRA. And so over 28,000 patients directly are receiving drugs whose development and innovation in that space would directly be disincentivized by the IRA in its current form, because of the stipulation that you will disincentivize new innovation for those patients specifically. So if we look at a specific example within that space, CLL is on the next slide, a pretty large but still rare hematological cancer. And there were quite a number of drugs approved for those. Those drugs, however, also had benefit in other rare hematological conditions. The that would no longer be receiving the benefit of this innovation. So out of all these 80,000, only 4,500 patients in this case study still would account for 250,000 years almost lost life just because of the stipulation of the IRA that you are disincentivized to develop in additional indications. So I know this was a bit quick, but the idea is if you have the IRA have the impact on these multi-cancer rare drugs, if we don't do anything differently, we're really looking at quite a phenomenal negative impact based on this tiny sliver of the larger graph that I showed on the slide before. So this is a big point of worry, and we're hoping to do something about that. I know that we're at time for my portion, so I'd like to move on to our other great panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. That's a really novel way of looking at kind of what's at stake and learning a lot about how R&D progresses for these different illnesses. So I do want to turn it over to our other panelists and talk more about some of the challenges that people living with these serious chronic illnesses face, what those ongoing unmet medical needs are, and the importance of continued research and innovation. So joining us are Molly Murray. She's the president and CEO of the Autoimmune Association, where she leads efforts to improve the lives of those living with autoimmune diseases by advancing the organization's 4 pillars: advocacy, awareness, education, and research. Also joining us is Claire Saxon. She is the Executive Vice President of Insights and Impact at Cancer Support Community. Cancer Support Community focuses on, and Claire, particularly at CSC, focuses on sharing the cancer support community's patient insights externally and ensuring that the patient experience remains central to all that cancer support community does, and that we make it more cancer care more patient-centric in general. And she is a longtime advocate, career advocate for health, including many leadership roles in the cancer community and otherwise. Also joining us is Arun Nagendra. She is the Director of Research and Scientific Affairs at the Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance. Arun is spearheading the development and execution of a scientific strategic plan that will leverage research projects and science communication to better serve the needs of those with lived experience of schizophrenia and related disorders. And she comes to us, the Alliance is a patient advocacy organization, but she also comes to us with clinical experience as well. So thank you all so much for joining us. Molly, I'm going to start with you. Martin talked about several differences in the availability and the need for different medicines for autoimmune and other conditions. So what are some of the challenges for people living with autoimmune conditions that they face on a daily basis? And why is innovation and having choices among treatment options particularly important?
Thanks, Candace. Thanks again for the invitation to be here and to weigh in on this discussion. Before I get started, I just want to do a time check. We've got about 15 minutes left, I think, for the. Okay, so I can kind of wrap up some of our.
Yeah, we've got time. We've got it scheduled till 12:30, but we've got a little time. So
okay,
yeah.
Wonderful then. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so to your point, yeah, there are certainly challenges that those living with autoimmune conditions face, and one of the primary challenges is the difficulty with diagnosis. Oftentimes a person will report a vagueness of symptoms. They'll say, I'm tired. Maybe they have an overall feeling of malaise, muscles or joint aches, stomach issues, etc. And these symptoms can really be a lot of different things, and it doesn't paint much of a picture for a healthcare provider to go off of in terms of making a diagnosis. And this can lead to a person being treated symptomatically for years. In fact, we say at the Autoimmune Association that it takes approximately 4.5 years on average for a diagnosis, and it can be much longer if you have a rare autoimmune disease. We recognize that the Autoimmune Association over 100 autoimmune and autoimmune-related diseases, from some that are more common, like lupus and Crohn's and colitis, to others like scleroderma and sarcoidosis, which are rare and can be hard for general practitioners to recognize and treat. which is why many individuals living with autoimmune diseases often need to go see a specialist, like a rheumatologist, before they receive a proper diagnosis. And then further compounding some of the challenges is that many individuals live with more than one autoimmune disease. And in fact, we know that having one autoimmune disease puts a person at higher risk for developing another. And if you're somebody that lives with more than one autoimmune disease, and plenty of people do, you can imagine how nuanced your treatment plan may need to be. So arriving at a diagnosis can be tough. And then once, hopefully a person does get a diagnosis, there is the hope that, you hope that a treatment is available that is effective. Martin's case studies were great. I think he did a great job of illustrating the positive health outcomes that may not have materialized had the novel GMG and NMO therapies not been developed. These therapies have clearly been game changers for those who are living with these conditions. But unfortunately, there remains many debilitating autoimmune conditions out there, oftentimes rare, with limited treatment options that are available. And those living with these diseases are really holding out hope that research will really deliver a novel therapy for them too. And, I just wanted to raise too that, you don't have to only have a rare disease and run into, issues with treatment options. Some that are, perhaps more prevalent, have more advanced treatments, a patient may not respond well to those, either, which kind of speaks to the need for a multitude of options. I'll give an example. In a 2017 study, researchers found that in a real world setting, 30 to 40% of patients on a first-line biologic therapy for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis experienced drug discontinuation, either because it was ineffective or because of adverse events. And they go on to say, kind of what the best strategies are for managing these failures hasn't been clearly defined, but that it seems to point to a personalized approach for the individual patient. So all of this is to say that autoimmune diseases are complex, they're difficult to treat, and there still remains a great unmet need for therapies that offer choices for personalized care. And the only way that we're going to be able to adequately meet these needs is through innovative research and development. And there's one more thing that I wanted to mention before we move on, is that autoimmune diseases are rising worldwide. And we've been working at the Autoimmune Association to raise the alarm bells about this because it's really a growing crisis. Some of you may have caught that there was an article in Monday's Washington Post that explores this, and it's titled, "Why Does It Feel Like Everyone Has an Autoimmune Disease?" And there's certainly a lot out there with an estimated 50 million Americans living with one or more. And it goes on to the reasons and theories about why this might be the case. But I will say that one of the more disturbing trends is the increase in young people. There is a growing population of youth who have a lifetime of chronic illness ahead of them. And early onset autoimmune disease means the risk of developing other autoimmune disease conditions increases. So it's my hope, it's certainly the hope of us at the Autoimmune Association, that we have innovative therapies that continue to be developed so that we're prepared to address this growing crisis. And Candace,
Thank you so much, Molly.
Sure.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. Claire, I'd love to hear from you as well. Martin talked about different cancer research and how it's unique in terms of starting with advanced stages often and then moving into less advanced stages. I was curious on your thoughts on that, how important it is to have medicines that are proven effective both at the advanced and early stages, and how important it is to have cancer medicines that often start with one FDA approval, but then are proven effective and gain other approvals for other different types of cancers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Candace. So I'm Claire Saxon, and Cancer Support Community works to provide support, compassionate communities, and break down barriers to care for people living with cancer, both patients and their loved ones who are helping them. And so, one of the things that we hear from the people who go to our 180 locations of Cancer Support Communities and Gilda's Club is how important new treatments are, both for hope for the future for people who currently have treatment options that are working for them, or have had treatment options that have worked for them, as well as for people who are living with diagnoses that have few treatment options available to them. You know, Martin described how cancer drug trials generally start in people with the most advanced disease, and then there's separate trials years later that are designed for testing that same drug in people with early stage cancer, once it's been approved for patients with advanced disease. And so if you have a clock ticking on how much companies are willing to invest in research and development, that could potentially limit the trials that are done to see how does this work in people with earlier stage disease. And there are dozens of examples of drugs that started out with patients in late stage that are now every day being prescribed for patients with early stage disease. We also in cancer see drugs that are approved for one type of cancer have separate drug trials once it's been approved in that one cancer for other kinds of cancers, whether that be other kinds because of what organ the cancer started in, you know, lung cancer versus kidney cancer versus brain cancer, or even to see if they work across multiple types of cancers with patients that have specific biomarkers that show that they might work. But those are generally separate drug trials that happen over time. And so it's really important to have people living with cancer getting access to the right treatment at the right time and having as many treatment options as possible, especially looking at drugs that potentially, because a lot of the newer, more innovative drugs have different side effect profiles that make it much more, give people much better quality of life while they're living both during the treatment and the long-term side effects that they see after the treatment. And so we are watching how price negotiation might distort the amount of money that is spent on research and development of cancer treatments. And so we've come together with other patient advocacy groups to really push CMS to talk about how it's going to benchmark and assess the implementation of this price negotiation and how that impacts research and development of new therapies. And so we came up with some patient-centered principles to make sure that we don't just wait for the federal regulators, CMS, to notice that there are impacts of the program and really keep an eye on it as the process is happening. So we know what are the impacts so we can start looking at corrective action as soon as possible, and looking at ways to make sure that patient feedback is included in the monitoring the impacts of drug price negotiations so that we can respond as quickly as possible to any ill effects. And, you know, we know that people living with cancer, there's all kinds of ways that they are affected by this price negotiation. Martin talked about antidepressants. You know, a third of the participants that we see are at risk for clinically significant depression. Rare cancers have a specific need to make sure that the orphan drug exclusion that allows specific additional support of diagnoses in rare cancers that can include in price negotiation so that drugs that treat rare cancers are excluded as long as their FDA approval uses are just for rare diseases, because it's so expensive to run these trials in populations that have small numbers of people who might benefit from it. And so if we don't include that orphan drug exclusion from price negotiation, we could potentially see many fewer rare drugs being developed, or drugs being developed for rare cancers. And so there, and again, Martin talked about small molecules, which are mostly oral drugs, being price negotiated sooner than IV and injection drugs. And this is particularly important from a health equity perspective, because we know that oral drugs can improve access to treatment for underrepresented communities, because people who have the least resources available to be able to take off from work because they're not paid unless they're there, that people who have the least amount of resources, it's harder for them to get to those appointments at infusion centers, and easier for them to take a drug at home and to be able to access their treatment. And so that's another important issue that cancer support community is pushing on and looking at in this whole price negotiation process. And I'll stop here for time.
No, that was fantastic, Claire. I think we could have a whole webinar talking more about some of the patient-centered impacts, and I'm excited to hear about this patient-centered principles. And we will include links to those materials and others from our speakers today on the PFCD website. So I do want to flag that for folks. I'm going to turn it over to Arun with a question, but if any of the audience members have questions, it's a great time to put those in the Q&A now. Arun, Martin highlighted some of the advances, especially for mental health medicines, and he was talking about severe depression, and I know you focus on schizophrenia and psychosis, but side effects can play a big role in terms of adherence, and also having different medicines available and having treatment options is really important for a host of diseases, but particularly so for severe mental illness. Can you talk about that a little bit? Why having different medicines available for schizophrenia is so important for patients, and why side effects are particularly challenging when it comes to adherence and treatment?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to just start by giving a little bit of background on kind of schizophrenia, and then move into some of the reasons that we think innovation is so important, and the role of side effects in that. So for those who do not know, schizophrenia is a spectrum of serious neuropsychiatric diseases, and it's characterized by an inability to accurately perceive reality. So people with schizophrenia have some combination of hallucinations, delusions, disordered thinking, difficulties with motivation, and other types of behaviors that really impair daily life. Schizophrenia and related psychotic disorders affect at least 1 in 100 people in the U.S., and it disproportionately impacts people of color and immigrant communities. So moving into treatment, people with schizophrenia typically require lifelong treatment. So this disease tends to onset at a really pivotal developmental time. So typically when people are in their late teens to their mid-20s, which means that their lives get completely derailed by it. So early intervention is critical and one of the strongest predictors of long-term outcomes. But we also don't have great treatment. Schizophrenia, as it stands, is severely debilitating. Most people with schizophrenia want to work, but only about 10% of them do. Most of them report being deeply lonely, but they cannot develop social connections. They're among the most isolated of folks out there. 10% die by suicide, and younger people are at higher risk of this. So, and those with schizophrenia comprise like an estimated 20 to 30% of people who are homeless. They're disproportionately imprisoned. And when they are imprisoned, they're more likely to receive the death penalty and to be put in solitary confinement. So the cost of having schizophrenia is incredibly high. We estimate it in terms of excess healthcare costs at over $280 billion a year. I bring up these points to emphasize the desperate need for effective treatments for schizophrenia. And the cornerstone and first line of schizophrenia treatment are antipsychotic medications. Unfortunately, For those who can access care, which is a whole thing in and of itself, only about a third of them are able to find medications that is actually effective in reducing their primary symptoms, hallucinations and delusions. But beyond this, schizophrenia is characterized also by severe cognitive challenges and also these sorts of passive symptoms like low motivations and difficulties expressing emotions that are actually really strong predictors of things like the ability to work and make friends and be in the community and live independently. These cognitive and passive symptoms are currently not addressed by existing medications. Um, Regarding side effects, those with schizophrenia have a shortened life expectancy by about 15 years. And this is actually partly due to side effects from existing antipsychotic medications. These side effects include heart disease, weight gain, motor disturbances, heavy sedation, and even things like unexpected lactation. So side effects for schizophrenia do not just have the potential to reduce life expectancy, they're frequently a reason for not taking medication. They can increase stigma and they just cause a lot of significant mental and physical anguish. So these kind of problems combine the ineffectiveness of ineffectiveness of current medications and the high toll of side effects means that many people try one medication after another to find one that just feels okay and works. And the toll of trying one medication after another includes repeated hospitalizations, sometimes progressive brain damage, symptom exacerbation, and just immense grief and agony for those with schizophrenia and their caregivers. And so this is why we think that there should be no additional barriers to care for those with schizophrenia, because innovation in medication is so desperately needed. And we champion this need for innovation. Innovation and more treatment options mean that people with schizophrenia could develop friendships, go on dates, spend meaningful time with their family, go to school and work, and just integrate into society in the ways that many of us simply take for granted. And they deserve this chance. The message is really clear to us. Innovation is not just medical, it's personal. It's a difference between people with schizophrenia surviving versus living. Now, almost all psychiatric medications are small molecules, since the nature of small molecule medications allows them to pass through the blood-brain barrier to treat the brain disease that they're targeting. So for this reason, and the other reasons that Martin mentioned, our stance is that the Inflation Reduction Act unfairly punishes people with psychiatric diseases, such as schizophrenia, by stifling really profoundly needed innovation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arun. It's just tragic all around, but clearly a high need for innovation for schizophrenia as well as cancer and autoimmune diseases. One question that I always like to ask people on this webinar is that we've covered a lot of ground, but if there were one or two key points that you would want people listening to take away from our discussion today, what would those be? Martin, do you mind if I start with you? You've got a lot of key points, but if you can narrow it down to 2 or 3, that'd be great.
I don't mind at all. I think my key points would be that while lowering cost and prices is a good idea, I think we need to do it in a way that does not get in the way of innovation that is really needed for many patients with high unmet need. And so I think there are a few aspects of the IRA that really should be reconsidered. And I outlined in my case studies what some of those might be to make sure that we're not punishing patients that have no options or suboptimal options today. I think that's the key. There's a real impact that we might feel if we cut down on innovation the way we are worried right now we might.
Thanks, Martin. How about you, Molly?
Yeah, thanks, Candace. I'd say, there's been incredible therapeutic advancements, right? For all of the patients that we represent and the diseases that they live with. But, I'd say that, there's still quite a bit of unmet medical need out there. And I think that kind of drives home the importance of why incentives need to be in place that encourage continued investment in the next generation of therapies. And then secondly, I'd say, no two patients are the same. Responses to available treatments can vary. That's certainly the case in autoimmune diseases, which is why it's really important that we have a variety of treatment options available.
Great, thank you. Claire?
Sure. I guess I'm going to talk more globally and say that if there's one thing that we should all come away from this webinar with, it's that all of these patient communities can't afford to wait for CMS and regulators to notice that there are impacts of price negotiation before looking at how to take corrective action, and that we need to make sure that CMS is getting patient voices of how is this impacting me included in all phases of the implementation of price negotiation, and that we can't wait to while we don't have the answers of exactly how to fix this, we need to understand how it will impact innovation and then start looking at what are the ways to fix that globally as patient organizations working together.
Great, thank you. Arun?
Hi. So I guess my kind of takeaways would be what I said. So people with schizophrenia do not have the medications that they need that are both effective and tolerable. They simply do not yet exist. And this has heartbreaking and sometimes lethal consequences. So we desperately and definitely need incentives for innovation in medications. And the IRA as it stands discourages this. And I'm just going to start to answer one of the questions I saw posed in the Q&A. Congress has the ability to level the playing field a little bit by providing the same 13-year protection that is already provided to large molecule treatments to small molecule treatments that can penetrate the blood-brain barrier to treat psychiatric conditions.
Thank you, Arun. I was going to go to that question next, so I appreciate you kicking that off. Others have thoughts there. Claire, you mentioned there's a lot CMS can do. What about Congress?
And Arun definitely hit the ball out of the park in talking about how making sure that all drugs have equal timelines to price negotiations would make sense. That and also another congressional action would be to ensure that the orphan drug exclusion is included in the Medicare price negotiation program, so that products that are exclusively approved for rare diseases are excluded from price negotiation as long as that's the only indications that they're approved for. That's another congressional action that could be taken.
Right, Molly or Martin, other things? Martin, you came off mute.
Yeah, no, I think the small molecules and rare disease exemptions definitely are a big area of concern. I think there could also be some more thought put into, and I typed it in the chat, so where are the real high unmet needs beyond that? And for example, in oncology, which again I'm raising as an area of particular concern just due to the treatment, the development paradigm, are there ways to lessen the impact for sort of early stage cancer drugs and things like that? Can we somehow take the timing component out of the equation or lessen the impact of the timing for a development that needs to happen post-approval? You
Appreciate
could,
that.
yeah,
Molly?
think
Oh,
about,
sorry, Martin.
sorry. No, it was the silence. I think maybe there's an opportunity for sort of indication-specific pricing, or for pricing being upheld in approvals that happen at a later time to sort of incentivize continued innovation. Sorry, no, Molly.
No, that's okay. I was going to piggyback off, of Claire's comments. I think she said it well. Some of the issues that we face around the rare disease exemption. Certainly I think the patient community recognizes that. There was, a letter that was led by NORD and Every Life Foundation that we joined at the end of 2023. There was 170 patient organizations that hopped on that letter, to call on Congress to make the technical fixes to the IRA's orphan drug exclusion. We're committed to keeping our foot on the gas on that and working with the patient community, to see that this gets corrected.
Thank you so much for that great discussion, and thank you all for joining us today. This webinar today, as well as the first and second installments of the At What Cost series, will be available on PFCD's YouTube channel. We welcome you to visit us there and share these in your networks. We plan to hold another webinar in the week of September 9th that will share health policy and economic perspectives, so diving a bit more into some of the congressional solutions potentially following the Medicare pricing announcements that we anticipate tomorrow, and also leading into Medicare open enrollment this fall. Please continue to follow along at #MoreThanAList on the PFCD social channels and on the fightchronicdisease.org website. You can find more details on our website under events and under At What Cost. Thank you again to our expert panelists and for all of you for joining us today.